Snow crunched under leather boots as Ensign Kazuo Sakamaki stepped down from the back of the truck. His wrists, bound in regulation-issue manacles, were stiff from the cold Wisconsin wind that bit through his thin Navy-issue khaki. Only 3 months earlier, he had been part of Japan's proud attack force, his midget submarine dispatched to Pearl Harbor. Now, on March 9, 1942, he found himself the first Japanese prisoner of war on American soil, arriving at Camp McCoy. The barbed wire fences were rimmed with icicles, a sight alien to a man raised under the humid skies of the Seto Inland Sea. He expected the worst: torture, starvation, or a dishonorable end. Instead, the first smell that reached him was beef. A mess line stretched ahead, steam rising from vats of stew and stacks of white bread. The guards ushered him forward, indifferent, almost bored. When a mess sergeant slapped a ladle of thick stew onto a metal tray, the fragrance of carrots, onions, and beef fat struck Sakamaki harder than any interrogation could. The next scoop was rice, sticky and hot. Then came something unimaginable, a tin cup filled with a white mound that shone against the metal. Ice cream, vanilla, and cold even in that northern winter. The numbers behind that plate were staggering. A U.S. soldier in 1942 consumed nearly 3,600 calories a day from Army rations like the C ration or 5-in-1 pack, each designed for abundance. Camp McCoy, built to hold thousands of Axis prisoners, drew on the endless surpluses of the Midwest: beef from Iowa, wheat from Minnesota, dairy from Wisconsin. By war's end, 2,700 Japanese prisoners would pass through this camp, alongside Germans and Italians, all of them fed under Geneva Convention standards. For Sakamaki, who knew his countrymen on Pacific garrisons were already rationing rice to the ounce, the sheer scale of food was a revelation more devastating than any bayonet. He stared at the ice cream, his hands trembling. Back in Japan, dairy had been a rare luxury reserved for hospitals or elite schools. To serve it casually to a captive seemed impossible. His breath rose in white clouds as he lifted the spoon. The first taste, sweet, cold, overwhelming, made his eyes water. These were not the tears of pain or humiliation, but of something he could not yet name. Perhaps it was the realization that an enemy who could waste sugar this way was an enemy Japan could never defeat. Behind him, the line shuffled forward, boots squeaking in the snow. Ahead, the mess sergeant shouted for the next man to move along. The war was far from over, but for Sakamaki, in that moment of shock over a scoop of ice cream, the foundations of faith and victory began to collapse. Sergeant James "Red" Callahan had been ladling stew since before sunrise, his forearms steaming in the chill as he worked the mess line. A farm boy from Iowa, he was used to abundance. Pork bellies hung in his father's smokehouse, barrels of corn stacked in the barn, butter churned fresh by his mother. To him, food was no miracle. It was labor, soil, and muscle turned into sustenance. But here at Camp McCoy, his ladle became a weapon more potent than any Springfield rifle. He watched the new prisoner, the Japanese officer with the sunken eyes, hesitate at the tray of ice cream. Callahan smirked. "First time, huh?" he muttered under his breath. For him, it was routine. The Army paid attention to calories, not culture. Yet he'd learned quickly that food broke down barriers faster than guards did. By 1943, orders came down from the Provost Marshal General. Feed them well, not only to uphold the Geneva Convention, but because fed men caused fewer problems and spoke more freely. Callahan adjusted his menus accordingly. Rice shipments were ordered in from West Coast warehouses, soy sauce procured, even sukiyaki appeared on the menu. It was, he admitted, strange to be cooking Japanese dishes in the Wisconsin winter while American boys bled in the Solomons. The statistics still amazed him. Each POW received a ration close to what U.S. troops got in the field: meat, bread, vegetables, milk. By comparison, Allied intelligence reported that American prisoners held by the Japanese were often surviving on 500 calories a day, reduced to gnawing on roots and grass. The irony wasn't lost on Callahan. while U.S. soldiers built an ice cream barge in the Pacific capable of churning 10 gallons every 7 minutes, Japanese soldiers starved on their own islands. In the mess hall, though, Callahan saw only hungry men. Some Japanese prisoners ate cautiously, expecting poison. Others devoured everything, licking their trays clean, unable to believe it was real. He noticed the whispers spreading through the camp. The Americans had so much food they gave it even to their enemies. That realization, more than propaganda or lectures, began to shift attitudes. As he set down the ladle after another long day, Callahan wiped his brow and chuckled to a fellow cook. "Funny, isn't it? We're fighting a war with butter as much as bullets." His friend nodded, stacking trays for the morning. Callahan looked out the window, where snow drifted against the barbed wire. Inside, the stove still glowed with heat, and the coolers brimmed with milk and eggs. He knew tomorrow would be the same. More stew, more rice, more ice cream. And he also knew the war was being won, one meal at a time. Dr. Eleanor Park adjusted her headset, the ear pads pressing against her temples as voices murmured through the monitoring line. She sat in a cramped room at Camp Tracy, California, the Army's top-secret interrogation center hidden in the Byron Hot Springs Resort. Here, walls once designed for luxury eavesdropped on men who had believed themselves unbreakable. Park, a Korean-American linguist, was tasked with listening, not only to words, but to pauses, sighs, the unguarded moments between sentences. She had noticed a pattern. The Japanese prisoners, hardened officers at first, became pliable after meals. Their skepticism melted when the mess hall rolled out dishes no one expected. Bowls of rice, pickles, sometimes even dried fish flown in from the coast. It was not a trick of brutality, but of abundance. She watched one prisoner cradle a cup of Coca-Cola like a religious object, staring at the fizz as though it were sorcery. Another was offered ice cream after a lecture. His hand shook so badly the spoon clattered against the cup. In those moments, the interrogation room felt less like a battlefield and more like a kitchen table, where loyalty cracked over dessert. Camp Tracy could house no more than 44 men at a time, but its impact rippled across the Pacific. Reports forwarded to Washington made clear. Better food and entertainment pulled prisoners toward cooperation faster than threats ever could. Park logged each slip. Names of units, fuel shortages, whispers about the Emperor's orders. She knew these revelations were seeded not only by her questions, but by the meals beforehand. The United States was fighting with butter as much as bullets, and Park was its quiet witness. The numbers told their own story. Across America, more than 425,000 Axis prisoners were held in camps, all fed at levels comparable to U.S. soldiers. Contrast that with Allied testimonies from Japanese camps, men living on half-starvation diets of 500 to 600 calories. That disparity, Park thought, was not incidental, but strategic. The American democracy had mobilized its farms and factories so completely that even its captives were evidence of impossible plenty. That night, Park wrote in her report, "Prisoner expressed astonishment at volume of food, noted that America appears to waste resources his homeland could not dream of. Psychological impact significant." She placed the folder in the outbox and rubbed her eyes. Outside, the California night hummed with cicadas. Tomorrow would bring another session, another meal, another revelation. She was certain now that the Empire of Japan was not being undone only on battlefields like Tarawa or Saipan. It was also unraveling here, in the simple act of rolling a barrel of ice cream into a camp and watching a proud officer break into tears. The sun hung low over Ulithi Atoll as Captain Harold Dixon stepped onto the deck of something so absurd it bordered on comedy. A barge built not for shells or oil, but for ice cream. The structure stretched 265 feet, a concrete hull tugged into position by Navy vessels. Inside, chillers hummed and compressors rattled, producing 10 gallons of frozen dessert every 7 minutes. Dixon, a logistics officer hardened by years of supply runs, shook his head. America had built a floating factory for treats while still producing destroyers and carriers in quantities that dwarfed anything the Japanese could imagine. It was 1944, and the Navy had calculated that morale demanded sweetness as much as steel. The BRL, barge, refrigerated large, could store 1,500 tons of frozen meat and 500 tons of chilled produce. But its showpiece was the ice cream plant. Sailors at Ulithi, bruised from battle, lined up for cups of soft serve, grinning like schoolboys. The sound of compressors blended with the clang of shipyards across the Pacific, the two halves of American war power, production and pleasure, operating as one. Dixon reviewed the numbers. $1 million had gone into this barge. To critics, it might have looked like waste, but in truth, it was strategy. A Navy sailor with sugar and dairy in his belly fought longer, endured harder. And when Japanese prisoners heard rumors of the barge, of a fleet so wealthy it could spare ships just for dessert, the psychological blow landed harder than any bomb. Compare the scale. By 1944, the United States had produced nearly 300,000 aircraft, a figure so vast that in a single year it outstripped Japan's total wartime production. While Japanese pilots flew one-way missions with barely enough fuel to return, American sailors ate ice cream on the decks of battleships. The statistics were as lethal as bullets. Dixon leaned on the rail, watching waves lap against the concrete hull. He thought of the boys in the Solomons, eating canned stew between firefights. He thought, too, of the prisoners of war across the ocean, men whose eyes widened at the sight of a simple dessert. For him, the barge was more than a curiosity. It was proof that America's abundance had reached such heights it could transform even sugar into a weapon. The compressors droned on, pumping sweetness into cups and cones. Dixon smiled despite himself. The Japanese could not match this, not in ships, not in planes, not in the quiet miracle of ice. He knew then, as clearly as any admiral, that the war's end was already written in the churn of the barge's machines. The jungle on Saipan was quiet, save for the rustle of men digging at the earth with bare hands. A squad of Japanese soldiers clawed at roots, their fingers muddy, their bellies hollow. The empire that had once swept across the Pacific now starved on the very islands it had conquered. Rice, once the centerpiece of the soldiers' ration, had dwindled to handfuls. Some boiled weeds, others chewed bark. The enemy still fought with ferocity, but their bodies betrayed them. Hollow cheeks, yellowed eyes, and the weariness of hunger. Reports filtering back to American intelligence painted a grim picture. Allied prisoners who had survived Japanese captivity told of starvation diets, often as low as 500 to 600 calories a day, barely a quarter of what a body at war required. Disease, dysentery, and exhaustion finished what hunger began. One Allied survivor wrote that men dreamed endlessly of bread, their sleep consumed by visions of buttered crusts they would never taste. Meanwhile, in Tokyo, the High Command tried to hide the truth. Factories were dispersed across small plants to avoid bombing, but the fragmentation only worsened shortages. Shipping losses turned resupply into a gamble. U.S. submarines prowled the sea lanes, sinking convoys before they reached island garrisons. Fuel disappeared first, grounding planes before pilots could fly. Then came food. By 1944, soldiers on Guadalcanal and Saipan were fighting on empty stomachs while hearing rumors that American prisoners in Wisconsin were eating sukiyaki in snow. The contrast was unbearable. In 1 month, a single American aircraft plant, Willow Run in Michigan, rolled out more B-24 Liberators than Japan could produce of all models combined in the same span. In the time it took a Japanese factory to hand-assemble an engine, the United States could ship thousands of tons of wheat across the Atlantic and Pacific. To the Japanese foot soldier, the truth arrived not in charts, but in his stomach. Hunger gnawed as surely as bullets killed. On Saipan, as U.S. Marines advanced, they found abandoned cooking pits with little more than grass boiled into soup. The smell of rot clung to the air, mingled with the acrid tang of cordite. American soldiers later recalled how the enemy fought with fanatical courage, but also with desperation born of emptiness. They were men forced to choose between surrender, unthinkable under Bushido, and starvation, which came all too easily. One Japanese corporal, captured near a collapsed bunker, whispered to his interrogators that he had not eaten rice in 3 weeks. When offered a biscuit, he wept. To him, the war was already lost, and it was not aircraft carriers or B-29s that proved it. It was the taste of flour in his mouth. The Texas sun burned hot across the dusty compound as guards wheeled a wooden barrel into the center of the yard. The prisoners, Japanese, weary from days of labor, stopped mid-task, staring. One guard shouted in broken Japanese, "Ice cream!" The lid came off, and cold mist drifted upward. Inside was a treasure beyond imagination. Gallons of vanilla and chocolate churned smooth, waiting to be scooped into tin cups. The reaction was immediate. Some prisoners laughed in disbelief. Others broke down, shoulders shaking as they held their cups with both hands. Tears mixed with sweat as they ate, tasting sugar for the first time in years. It was not merely dessert. It was evidence of a world their commanders had told them did not exist. This was no accident. American camp policy encouraged rewards to reinforce good behavior. Compliance meant extra rations, watermelons in summer, sometimes even a barrel of ice cream. For men raised on tales of American cruelty, the reality was shattering. A Japanese POW at one camp wrote later, "Even in captivity, they gave us more food than we had as soldiers." Then I knew we had been deceived. Behind the spectacle lay cold arithmetic. The United States held 425,000 Axis prisoners across the mainland, feeding them all at levels comparable to its own troops. That meant daily caloric outputs in the millions, sustained by farms that stretched from Kansas wheat fields to California dairies. The logistics chain that carried Sherman tanks and P-51 Mustangs to Europe also delivered ice cream to a POW in Texas. This was abundance weaponized, hospitality turned into strategy. The guards noticed the transformation. Work details grew easier when men expected rewards. Intelligence officers received more cooperation when prisoners felt their captors treated them as human beings. Even pro-imperial factions struggled to counter the evidence of American plenty when their comrades walked back from labor licking their spoons clean. For the prisoners, the memory lingered. One later recounted to his family in Japan how he had eaten until his stomach hurt, then cried, not from pain, but from shame. He realized his homeland could not hope to match such power. If America could waste this much on its enemies, how could Japan ever prevail? As the barrel was rolled away, the yard filled with murmurs. Some prisoners sat quietly, staring at the horizon. Others returned to their chores with uncharacteristic diligence. The war had not ended, but for those men, the battle for belief was over. A scoop of ice cream had become the most decisive weapon of all. The map room in Washington glowed with the steady hum of projectors and the scratch of pencils against graph paper. War Production Board officials gathered around charts that rose like skyscrapers, columns of numbers that seemed impossible, even to those who wrote them. One figure in bold red ink captured the scale. By 1943, nearly 40% of America's gross national product was directed toward war. Each line item told its own story. Aircraft plants, once sleepy assembly halls, now roared day and night. Willow Run in Michigan, Henry Ford's bomber plant, produced a B-24 Liberator every 63 minutes, a pace that outstripped entire nations. In 1 month, that single factory delivered more planes than Japan could hope to construct across all its dispersed facilities in the same period. Tank production was so vast that generals joked they could pave highways with Shermans. Even the most skeptical statistician could not deny the truth. America was outproducing its enemies by ratios that defied belief. Yet these numbers weren't abstract. They were served daily on the plates of prisoners thousands of miles away. At Camp McCoy, each Japanese POW consumed rations built from this industrial miracle. 3 meals a day, balanced in calories and protein, required wheat from Kansas, beef from Iowa, and dairy from Wisconsin. The logistics chain that carried bombs to B-29s also delivered rice and pickles to men who had once sworn to die rather than surrender. To Japanese eyes, the implications were staggering. While their families at home queued for ration cards, American prisoners of war, men in captivity, received food their free countrymen could not dream of. The sight of ice cream in a Wisconsin mess hall was not a curiosity, but a revelation. America's production was so great that it overflowed even into enemy bellies. Officials in Washington understood this psychological effect, even if they never put it on the graphs. They saw the strategic outcome in interrogation reports, in POW letters, in intelligence briefings that noted astonishment at American abundance. It was not only bombs and bullets that broke the enemy, but biscuits and butter. In the War Production Board's offices, the charts kept climbing, each bar higher than the last. America had built an arsenal so vast it could feed its prisoners and still drown the Pacific in steel. A single line on the chart, 300,000 aircraft produced by war's end, would have seemed fantasy in 1941. By 1944, it was reality. One official capped his pen and leaned back, staring at the numbers that spoke louder than speeches. "We've already won," he murmured. And somewhere in Wisconsin, a prisoner staring at his plate was beginning to believe the same. Snow fell softly over the wire at Camp McCoy, muffling the crunch of boots and the distant clang of guard towers. Inside the mess hall, warmth gathered in clouds of steam, rising from bowls lined neatly along the counter. It was January 1945, and the Wisconsin cold bit hard. Yet for the Japanese prisoners who shuffled forward with tin trays in hand, what awaited them was comfort beyond imagining. Steaming rice, slices of beef, cabbage simmered with soy sauce, and the unmistakable flavor of sukiyaki. The adaptation had been deliberate. American cooks had learned that resentment faded when meals resembled home. Rice shipments were trucked in, soy sauce procured from West Coast suppliers, even dried fish rationed into menus. Sergeant Callahan, who once joked that he was fighting the war with a ladle, found himself stirring pots of sukiyaki while snow howled outside. It was a strange inversion, serving Japanese dishes in America's heartland, but the effect on the prisoners was undeniable. The men ate in silence at first, savoring the warmth. Some closed their eyes, as though transported back across the Pacific. For soldiers who had watched comrades starve on Saipan and Guadalcanal, the contrast was unbearable. Here, in captivity, they ate better than their families did in freedom. The knowledge spread through whispers. The Americans not only had enough to feed themselves, but enough to feed their enemies generously. The statistics underscored the reality. Each prisoner's ration averaged more than 3,000 calories a day, nearly 6 times what Allied POWs endured under Japanese custody. The Geneva Convention provided the framework, but America's industrial machine supplied the abundance. Midwestern farms that produced butter and beef in staggering quantities made sukiyaki in a POW camp possible. Even the snow outside became part of the irony. While Japanese soldiers froze on Manchurian fronts with empty stomachs, their captured comrades warmed themselves with bowls of hot stew in Wisconsin. The guards noticed the change. Discipline grew easier. Interrogators reported more cooperation. Loyalty, once ironclad under Bushido, cracked quietly in the presence of hot food. Some prisoners confessed that this generosity forced them to reconsider everything Tokyo had told them. As the meal ended, bowls clattered into bins, steam still curling into the rafters. Outside, snow piled higher against the wire, muffling the world. Inside, stomachs were full, and the memory of hunger gave way, if only for a moment, to contentment. One prisoner whispered to another, "If this is captivity, what was freedom worth?" The words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. And somewhere beyond the storm, the American war machine kept churning, ensuring tomorrow's sukiyaki would be ready on time. The interrogation room was plain, its walls bare save for a single lamp that cast long shadows across the table. Dr. Eleanor Park sat with her notes spread before her, pencil poised. Across from her, a Japanese petty officer shifted uneasily, his hands wrapped around a steaming mug of coffee. Outside, the hum of the mess hall still lingered, the smell of rice and grilled meat drifting faintly down the corridor. Park had learned to time her sessions carefully. Full stomachs made for loose tongues. It was not cruelty that softened these men, but the unrelenting generosity of their captors. After bowls of sukiyaki or a rare dessert, words tumbled out that discipline alone could never unlock. The prisoner sipped slowly, eyes darting, then began to speak of shortages, of planes grounded for lack of fuel, of convoys scattered by submarines, of officers who whispered despair when no one was listening. Park recorded it all with the precision of a stenographer. She had seen this pattern too often to doubt it. At Camp Tracy, the Army's hidden listening post in California, men who had sworn to die for the Emperor confessed after a cup of Coca-Cola. They marveled at the fizzing sweetness, the luxury of something their homeland could not provide even to officers. Others recounted with trembling voices how ice cream at the mess table had reduced them to tears, their iron self-image collapsing into childlike wonder. The reports piled up. Each file contained revelations gleaned not through brutality, but through abundance. Prisoners spoke of dispersal factories in Japan that produced only a handful of engines each month. They described pilots forced into one-way missions with barely enough fuel to climb into the sky. They admitted their fear upon learning that Americans could afford to waste resources on prisoners while Japan struggled to feed its armies. Numbers threaded through every account. One prisoner whispered that his unit had received rations of 600 calories a day on Saipan. Park noted it carefully, comparing it to the 3,000 calories the same man now consumed in captivity. That disparity was a weapon sharper than any bayonet, and she knew it. At night, Park wrote her summaries in clean, precise language. Prisoner astonished at American abundance. Cooperation increased after improved meals. Psychological shift observed. She placed the file in the outbox, aware that somewhere in Washington, men with pens and charts would use her words to plan the next step of the war. When she turned off the lamp, the room fell silent. Outside, cicadas buzzed in the California night. Tomorrow, another prisoner would sit across from her, another spoonful of sugar breaking another oath of silence. The war was being won, one report at a time. The gulch at Honolulu was hot that afternoon, the sun baking the corrugated tin of the mess hall roof until it shimmered like a forge. Inside, Japanese prisoners lined up with trays in hand, sweat beading on their brows. A guard barked an order, and from the kitchen emerged something no one expected: ice cream, scooped into cups, alongside bottles of Coca-Cola that clinked in wooden crates. The reaction was immediate. Some prisoners of war blinked in disbelief, frozen in place. Others shuffled forward with trembling hands. One officer, rigid with Bushido pride, stared at the cup before him until the guard motioned impatiently. Slowly, he lifted the spoon. The first bite was tentative, but the sweetness overwhelmed him. His eyes filled with tears. He tried to hide his face, but the moment was too raw. He wept openly, spoon scraping against tin. The guards had seen it before. Better meals and entertainment often broke the icy walls of defiance. At Honolulu, where nearly 4,000 POWs lived under the Hawaiian sun, such tactics were deliberate. Meals were improved. Phonographs played American jazz, and prisoners were invited to lectures. But it was the ice cream and the Coke that struck hardest. These were not weapons of force. They were symbols of a nation so wealthy it could afford luxuries in the middle of war. The numbers were staggering when set beside the scene. While this prisoner consumed a cup of ice cream worth perhaps a dime, his comrades still in uniform were starving on less than 600 calories a day. While he drank a Coca-Cola, Japanese civilians at home waited hours in ration lines for a bowl of millet. America's abundance was not just visible, it was edible, and it shattered illusions faster than any leaflet dropped from a B-29. For the prisoners who cried, it was more than hunger, it was betrayal. Tokyo had taught them that capture meant torture, starvation, dishonor. Instead, they found themselves weeping over sweetness, discovering humanity where they had been told there would be none. That realization shook their loyalty more than any lecture could. As the officer set down his empty cup, the guard collected the tray without comment. Outside, the gulch shimmered in the heat, the mountains of Oahu rising beyond the wire. Inside, men murmured quietly, some ashamed, others relieved. One prisoner whispered, "The war is already lost. Even their prisoners eat like kings." The sound of bottles clinking echoed through the hall. The tears had dried, but the revelation remained. America's victory was measured not just in steel and fire, but in the quiet power of vanilla and sugar. In Tokyo, 1945, the air was heavy with smoke from the latest bombing raids. The city's once proud avenues were scarred by fire breaks and rubble. Deep inside the military headquarters, officers sat in silence, papers spread before them. Reports had filtered back from captured men, now repatriated through neutral channels. At first dismissed as exaggerations, the stories became impossible to ignore. American camps where prisoners ate beef, rice, and ice cream. The numbers told a brutal truth. While Japanese cities rationed rice to bowls of millet and sweet potatoes, America's production machine roared unchecked. In 1 year alone, Willow Run delivered more bombers than Japan could hope to build in 5. The U.S. Navy had built a barge solely to churn ice cream in the middle of the Pacific, 10 gallons every 7 minutes, while Japanese convoys struggled to deliver a single sack of rice to island garrisons. The comparison was obscene. Some officers tried to suppress the rumors, fearing their effect on morale. But whispers spread among pilots and infantry alike. America had so much it wasted food on enemies. A single POW diary, smuggled through neutral Switzerland, described barrels of ice cream wheeled into camps in Texas. "We ate until our stomachs hurt," the entry read. "Then we wept." Those words traveled faster than propaganda, breaking the myth of American cruelty. Fuel shortages now grounded aircraft that had once bombed Shanghai and Manila. Ammunition was rationed. Soldiers dug foxholes with empty stomachs. The high command knew the truth, even if they did not speak it aloud. The empire's strength was an illusion, propped up by fanaticism, already dissolving in the face of industrial democracy. By summer, the contrast grew unbearable. American B-29s dropped incendiaries by the thousands, burning entire districts in a single night. Japan could not replace its losses. For every plane Japan built, America built 50. For every ton of rice shipped to the front, America sent thousands of tons of wheat overseas. The arithmetic was destiny. One admiral, staring at the charts, broke his silence. "If they waste sugar this way," he muttered, "we cannot hope to win." His colleagues avoided his eyes, but none contradicted him. The empire cracked not only under bombs, but under the realization that America had fought the war with butter, sugar, and abundance as surely as with steel. Outside, Tokyo smoldered. Inside, defeat had already been tasted, sweet and cold, like vanilla on a prisoner's tongue. The war was over, and Japan lay in ruins. Cities that had once glowed with lanterns now smoldered with ash. Into this shattered landscape marched American soldiers, not as conquerors with bayonets drawn, but as providers carrying crates of food. A boy in Yokohama, barefoot amid rubble, lifted a bottle of Coca-Cola, handed to him by a GI. He sipped, eyes widening at the fizz, and smiled despite the destruction around him. It was the same smile that had crossed the faces of prisoners years earlier when given their first ice cream. The legacy of America's abundance was more than victory. It was transformation. Former POWs told their families of meals that had once seemed impossible. Rice and sukiyaki in Wisconsin snow, barrels of ice cream in Texas, Coke bottles in Hawaiian gulches. These stories clashed with years of propaganda, forcing a reckoning. If the enemy had been capable of such generosity even in war, perhaps their system, industrial democracy, was stronger than the myths of imperial tradition. Numbers reinforced the lesson. America had produced 300,000 aircraft, launched more ships than the rest of the world combined, and grown its economy to $135 billion by 1944. But beyond steel and firepower, it had fed millions, its soldiers, its allies, its enemies. That ability to nourish while destroying revealed the true depth of power. The ice cream barge at Ulithi became a symbol of absurd wealth, yet also of strategy, a nation so strong it could sustain comfort at war's frontiers. In occupied Japan, these impressions reshaped society. Food programs, school lunches, and aid shipments restored faith in survival. The same men who had once wept in POW camps became witnesses to their country's rebirth under American guidance. The tears over barbecue and ice cream had not been weakness. They were the first cracks in a wall of ideology, proof that a system built on scarcity could not withstand one built on abundance. For Americans, the lesson was clear. Victory was not accidental. It was forged in Detroit's assembly lines, Iowa's cornfields, Wisconsin's dairies, and California's shipyards. It was expressed in the comfort of a warm meal, the sweetness of sugar, the taste of home carried across oceans. Democracy had triumphed not only in battle, but at the dinner table, defeating tyranny with the quiet power of plenty. As the boy in Yokohama finished his Coke, he looked up at the smiling GI and laughed. That laughter, light and unexpected, carried further than bombs or bullets. It was the sound of a new world being born, one shaped not just by victory in war, but by the promise of peace built on abundance.